Welcome to Peloton Magazine and Aérogramme subscribers. This podcast is created in partnership with the global team at La Course on Tête and the crew at award-winning Peloton Magazine. Keep your breath bated for the Peloton Pass, which will include this podcast and be available for all fans of cycling in 2021. And Jeremy, what sort of psychopath designs the longest race in the calendar and lets it go for 299 kilometres? Why not just do a full 300? Why not round it up and make it a whole number?
I know, that extra kilometre could have made all the difference. Could have given it a cliffhanging edge.
Ooh, imagine.
This is Jeremy Whittle on the south coast, cooking up a storming korma.
This is Peter Cossins in the Pyrenees. Not on my way across the Pyrenees to the Volta, Catalunya, unfortunately.
I'm Sophie Smith in Melbourne on the other side of the world.
And it's OJ in a studio next to a ship canal. Now, the Spring Classics are back and Flow Bikes have you covered. Watch the Tour of Flanders, Gent-Wevelgem, Amstel Gold and more, live and on demand in the United States, Canada and Australia, plus go inside the race with athlete interviews, in-depth course previews, expert analysis and other exclusive content. The cobbles, they are calling, so don't miss out. Subscribe now at flowbikes.com/aerogram. That's flobikes.com/aerogram. And when the cobbles do call, Pete, what sound do they make?
I think it's like a low rumble. Things, bits falling off. Everything's juddering.
Yeah, I've ridden the cobbles before and I can still feel it. And it was about 8 years ago. Now, here's a question for you. Did anyone watch the entirety of La Primavera?
I watched most of it.
I gutted my bathroom.
6.5 hours, I have to admit that I did not.
Did you? How much?
It's a long time to be in the saddle or in front of a TV.
Yeah, how much did you watch, Sophie?
I caught up on highlights, to be fair, this time around. I shouldn't admit that, but 6.5 hours on my time was would have been an all-nighter, and I did a 12-hour stint moving that day, so it was highlights for me the next morning.
Some would say 12 hours moving house is a little bit like watching La Primavera or Milan-San Remo.
It's a little bit like riding.
Yeah, there was a really good website, is Milan-San Remo exciting yet.com, which I kept clicking on, and the answer for a lot of it was no until about the last 4 or 5 minutes. Anyway, we'll look back at Milan-San Remo and the endless minutes of excitement. We'll look forward to Gent-Wevelgem and also try and find out what has happened to one of the brightest stars of the 2020 Tour de France, with some odd goings-on during his off-season transfer. Hirschi Bard? We'll find out. But first, let's hit the club chair with a man who may or may not be in short trousers, but is always long in all of the news from another week of bike racing.
Well, here I am, back in the club chair for another season. This week, however, with no G&T in my hand, just a whopping great glass of Italian red, for obvious reasons. Quite the weekend for Trek Segafredo, taking both the headline races with Jasper Stuyven at Milan-San Remo and Elisa Longo Borghini at the Binder Trophy. Add in Mads Pedersen's Kuurne-Brussels-Kuurne win, and that's not a bad start to a year. It was only last weekend, however, lest we forget, that we were drooling over Matthew van der Poel's epic stage win at Tirreno, at Tadej Pogacar's push for the overall title, and Wout van Aert's stunning form shown in that time trial on Tuesday. Stuyven's win in Milan-San Remo, though, came ahead of all these favourites, textbook perfect, an attack when all the big guys were marking each other at the foot of the Poggio, and he then played Søren Kragh Andersen to perfection in the final couple of 100 metres. Otherwise this week, we saw a fine win for Ludovic Rebate of the little-rated Bingol Wallonie-Bruxelles team in a brutally hard knocker course on Wednesday. We saw Tim Merlier extending his run of sprint victories at Bred in a Coxside on Friday, and all of a sudden, yikes, it's Belgian Classics time already. News-wise, the big story of the week broke on Friday, when former Team Sky chief Dr. Richard Freeman was ruled unfit to practice by the General Medical Council, something which leaves questions to answer for Team Ineos head Dave Brailsford. It's not what you want when you aspire to be the best team in the world. In other news, the UCI has extended the road racing season to the end of October to allow for races to be shifted around due to COVID. Among of the events already rearranged is the UK Women's Tour, which is now set for the first week of October and will include a 10-mile time trial in the route for the first time. Pandemic-wise, there are concerns now that Paris-Roubaix for men and women may be affected by yet another lockdown in France. Keep your eyes on that one, and let's just enjoy the racing while we can.
William Fotheringham there with some fine advice. Let's enjoy it while we can. Jeremy, Paris-Roubaix. We got very excited about it last week. Is it going to happen? I say yes, but more in diehard optimism than actual knowledge.
I think it's an interesting problem they've got, because we've got a precedent already, which Pete is well aware of, which was the final weekend of Paris-Nice, when Nice was in lockdown. So they took the start and finish of the final two stages on the Saturday and Sunday out of Nice. Partly because, that is a big city, a much bigger city than kind of Compiègne or Lille, where Paris-Roubaix starts and finishes. And also because I think that, the final stages of Paris-Nice are on the Promenade des Anglais, which is kind of the beachfront and very, very popular at weekends. With Paris-Roubaix, you've got a relatively kind of rural start and a finish in a big city, but I'd have thought it's quite easy to seal it off and just make it completely about the peloton and the suiveurs, that is the people in team cars and the media who are around it, and ensure that everybody's in a bubble. I don't see it's the same situation as the situation they had in Nice, but maybe Pete thinks differently. What do you think, Pete?
I think it'll probably go ahead. Actually, I think the issue in Nice was very much tied into the Promenade des Anglais, and the mayor there, Christian Estrosi, wanted to keep the Promenade des Anglais open to locals, so they could actually get out and about a bit and not have it locked down for the race. I think, like you say, Paris-Roubaix runs right across several of the departments that are locked down, but it's rural. Nobody's going to be allowed out of the roadside, I wouldn't have thought. And once you get into Roubaix itself, the velodrome comes pretty quickly. You don't actually go right into the centre of the town. So, I don't know, I think you could probably go ahead.
That was my sentiment as well, that it's more of an isolated race along the cobble sectors. The most public part probably is the velodrome, and they don't let anyone in there.
But if they police it, because it's effectively a straight line, isn't it? It's not. I know it's not a straight line, but it's the course is fairly much a straight line, just moving to the northeast of France and the border with Belgium. If they police all the junctions, I know there's a lot of junctions, but if they police all those, then I can't see why you couldn't have the race, really.
I sort of feel we've got to the point now, the pandemic world we're living in, this corona world, where almost anything can go ahead with enough planning beforehand. And you sort of feel with Milan-San Remo, Italy was locked down, wasn't it, during the race, during the weekend? Therefore, why can they not run a race like Paris-Roubaix? Plus, do you think, Pete, the fact that it didn't run last year, and it is such an icon of the cycling calendar, do you think they'll be double keen to make sure it runs in 2021?
I don't think that's really going to have an impact at all, but I think what probably will have an impact is the fact that, Lille, who, before tonight, they were the top team in the French league, and they were playing at home tonight against Reims, I think. So they obviously flew a team from outside the zone, or brought them in by coach into the zone. So sport is still going ahead. That's the point I'm trying to make. And if football teams are allowed to travel around, and I guess other sports are continuing as well. We had the Welsh team coming in to play rugby in Paris yesterday. I don't see why Paris-Roubaix shouldn't go ahead. There seems to be a precedent there to allow it to. Maybe
we shouldn't mention any more about it, just in case it gets binned off while we're uploading this podcast. Just a quick mention as well before we get into Milan-San Remo. The Trofeo Alfredo Binda, if you missed the race, Elisa Longo Borghini of Trek Segafredo took off, rode away from a chasing pack. Jeremy, I know you didn't catch the race, but it just shows you how powerful she is.
Yeah, and she's one of my favourite riders, because every time I've seen her race, she's been incredibly aggressive and attacking, so I was pleased to see that result. And she obviously really, really dominated it, because if you look at the time gap, it's pretty impressive. I think what I loved about that as well was it was the centrepiece of a Sunday as the classics get going, and I think that's really brilliant for women's racing. That it was the main highlight of one of the two highlights of the weekend.
And it's a lovely little course as well, very nice course. Now let's talk about the 112th edition of Milan-San Remo, 299 kilometres of Italian sightseeing. Sophie, maybe talk us through the exciting part of the race, which is what, the final 7 kilometres?
I know you really don't.
Oh, I know. Do you know what? I need to stop being so down on it. I really do need to stop being so down on it. But I actually watched them. I did, for the first time in a few years, I watched some Milan-San Remo, and it was exactly as I remember it. This is going to be
it's just a proper Italian race, isn't it? It's 299 kilometres long. It's mammoth, but it's like traditional to like the Italians. They just don't care. They're like, we're honouring cycling's heritage. probably doesn't work as much for spectators and fans because it's a long slog to watch, but it's very, very pretty.
It doesn't really work for an American audience, this, but I was going to say it's a lot like watching a test match. Now, a cricket test match is 5 days long and can still end in a draw. And it feels a little bit like that.
Yeah, I hate cricket, but that's not the case for San Remo.
You're Australian!
And I particularly hate test cricket. It's boring. But San Remo is different. And I think normally, I mean, the Poggio didn't really deliver this year in terms of attacks, did it? We were speaking last week about how the races decided there. And unless you count Stuyven's move on the descent or toward the end of the descent, I feel like it normally delivers similar attacks on the same climb, but there's always, no one from my memory in recent times has won it more than once. I mean, that speaks to something of the race, I think.
I think the trouble with it is that they, unless you get extreme weather or you get lots of crashes or you get just extreme circumstances when there's an attack on the Poggio that has to be reeled in before the line. I mean, the most exciting one in recent memory for me is the year that Vincenzo Nibali won, when he basically attacked off the top of the Poggio, well, over the top of the Poggio, and just arrived ahead of the speeding bunch, and that was in 2018. And since then, I think it's a bit homogenous, isn't it? And it is beautiful. I mean, I love that part of Italy. It's really beautiful. I've been there on holiday a couple of times. The riding's fantastic, inland in the hills. Seafood is great. The pesto is great. All of that. But, I mean, it was the longest lead out ever, wasn't it? It was 300 kilometres, and you really only needed to watch the last 5? Really?
The last 2.
Yeah, and if you're trying to explain that to new fans of cycling, why it's so gripping as they come over through Savona and then up the Tre Capi, and all of that. If you're trying to explain all of that, it's quite a hard sell, I think. And in a world where sport is getting, cycling is fighting other sports for airtime the whole time. To have a race like that seems really indulgent. And I speak as a purist as well. But the acid test for me is if you said, okay, you can only have one monument from Strade Bianche or Milan-San Remo, which one are you going to choose? I think we all know what the answer would be.
Strade Bianche.
Every time.
I'll say it. If no one's going to say it, I'll say it. Because I
like San Remo on the field is a bit more diverse. Nibali wins it one year.
Yeah. I guess so.
Stuyven another. Different types of riders every season.
I guess so. Well, let's take a look at who did win the exciting part of it. Jasper Stuyven won it of Trek Segafredo. It was that attack that went over the top. It seemed to feel to me, Pete, that it was one of those attacks where he didn't really think it was going to work, and then everyone messed around behind him.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I think when we were talking last week about the race, and I think everybody was the same in this. Everybody was talking about Alaphilippe, Van Aert, and Van der Poel. And at that stage, Tirreno Adriatico was going on, and those 3 guys were knocking 7 bells out of each other. And I just got the impression that when we got to the Poggio, when we expected something from these 3 guys, they basically they didn't look like they had it in them. They had, I think there were 11 or 12 guys in that front group that came over the top. Stuyven was at the back. He rode really well, and amazingly, Caleb Ewan, the Lotto sprinter, was in the group as well. And of course, he was the fastest guy, or him or Van Aert were the fastest guys. And so everybody was watching those 2 guys. And Stuyven, just as they got towards the bottom, just before they got into San Remo, off the bottom end of the Poggio, he attacked, went away, and Søren Kragh Andersen actually made a fantastic effort to get across to him, but Stuyven just played it like William said. Stuyven played it perfectly. He kind of let Kragh Andersen lead for a bit and then just swept by him. And he, even like 100 metres from the line, I think he knew he'd won it.
Well, let's hear from the defending champion, Wout van Aert, at the finish line of Milan-San Remo.
I think I'm disappointed to not win the race. My legs were good enough to do that, I guess, but and the final was a difficult race situation for me. I don't know if I could do something different, but still was a close call. So
He said that from Stuyven and came from nowhere. There was nothing to do.
Well, not from nowhere. I expected, of course, some attacks, especially after coming on the top of the Poggio with quite some guys. That was surprising for me, but apparently it was was a big group coming on the top, and that's normal that at the bottom some guys try their luck, and then it's always difficult if you have a good sprint to take the right choice, and yeah.
What does Milan-San Remo do? Does it stay as this pure 300-kilometre ride through Italy, or does it change? Does it need to change, Jeremy? And if it does need to change, what does it do?
I think you get a good Milan-San Remo kind of 1 year in 4, 1 year in 3, maybe 1 year in 4, something that's really for the ages, or maybe even 1 year in 5, which isn't a bad hit rate, I suppose. But it's been memorable when there's been big stack-ups. It's been memorable when the weather's been really bad. When you get a day like yesterday, when you've got, or on Saturday rather, when you have a tailwind, pretty good weather, and everybody in such amazing form, which the whole bunch seems to be really flying, then it kind of cancels itself out. And I don't know if they need another little climb between Cipressa and Poggio, or something just to brighten it up, or they need maybe even an uphill sprint in San Remo. I mean, I have been to San Remo a couple of times. I don't know it well enough to pinpoint the street they should use, but just something, or the finish line near the bottom of the Poggio, which again, these will all be logistical issues, but I don't know, it feels like sometimes it feels like the years are interchangeable.
I'm not much of a traditionalist, except when it comes to first dates, but I'm going to maybe have the unpopular opinion and say you keep it as it is, even if we had an edition like the one this year where there wasn't fireworks. I know there seems to be this tendency perhaps with sport, and I'll put it out there, that it's almost becoming a bit clickbaity. It's like unless it's short and punchy and there's explosives over something like San Remo that's a long burn, people become disinterested. But even looking at that finale, like past the winner, you had Caleb Ewan, who had a quiet start to the season because there was no Tour Down Under, and Sam Bennett smashed the majority of the UAE Tour. And then you had Peter Sagan even in fourth, who I'd completely written off last week because he had COVID, got diagnosed with COVID in January, and his team had said lost pretty much all of his winter base. So I think if nothing else, we had a surprise winner. I personally Stuyven wasn't even in my top 10, and an indication of the guys that perhaps are going to be particularly strong.
What was interesting is that there's this kind of dialogue that goes on all the time, or monologue maybe, that when you talk to riders are saying that you need to race hard going into San Remo. And it was interesting when you look back at the guys that actually featured. Stuyven rode Paris-Nice, which was obviously shortened at the back end by the COVID restrictions they had, and some of the early stages weren't as hard as they were expecting to be, and he actually featured nowhere in Paris-Nice. I think his top position was like 50. Well, I think he's finished 50 odd overall. I think he maybe got into the top 20 one day. Caleb Ewan didn't start the third stage of Tirreno, so he missed all the really bad bits of it. Peter Sagan rode Tirreno but didn't feature at all. So I mean, it was interesting that these guys that didn't really do too much in the weeks coming up to it emerged and kind of, I mean, you can't really say they dominated, but they were in the right place at the right time. And I mean, having said that, I think I agree with Sophie that it produced a really interesting finale. I think that one of the big disappointments for everybody is the fact that Van Aert, Alaphilippe or Van der Poel didn't win it, because then it would have been a huge story. Then it would have been like, my God, they've done it again, and this great duel goes on. But
as Jasper Stuyven said himself, there are other people to win races.
Exactly, yeah, of course there are, and that was the beauty of his win. I mean, this guy's a former world junior champion. He's obviously got huge talent. This could be the first of many monuments that he wins.
Well, I think as much as I have been very down on Milan-San Remo, and there is almost an anti-humour in it. I saw social media was full of people, as with the website is milansanremoexcitingyet.com. There was lots of people taking a bit of joy in it not being exciting until the past few minutes. So maybe you're right. Maybe the traditionalism is the fact that it's not entertaining until you get to this end bit. And then, as Jeremy said, 1 in 5 is exciting. Well, anyway, the first classic of the year is done. Before we get to looking at next weekend's Gent-Wevelgem, let's have a look at the Volta Catalunya. And as our man almost in Catalunya, Pete, where are you right now? I thought you were heading there.
I'm in the Ariège, which is kind of just over the border where you've got to go through Andorra to get to Catalunya. So we're not too far away. I'm like maybe 150 kilometres away, but there's been a lot of snow up here in the last few days, and unfortunately I haven't got the right kind of snow tyres on my car at the moment. So
that's the worst excuse I've ever heard. What's the right kind of snow tyres? How many types of snow tyre are there?
Where you can have like an intermediate tyre, or you have on the full on snow tyre that's got like proper tread on it that you can pretty much go anywhere, or you can put snow chains on. And I'd lent my snow chains to my next door neighbour Christoph, and I haven't got them back yet, so I'm stuck at home.
It's funny, they're always called Christoph.
Yeah, next door neighbours, aren't they?
The ones who disappear the snow chains in the Pyrenees.
Okay, well, talk us through the week of the Volta Catalunya and the key stages. What are we looking out for? Who's racing there?
We've got Chris Froome is appearing. The Yates brothers are riding, but in different teams for the first time. We've got... I can't remember who else is riding on the Ineos team now. They've got Richie Porte back in.
They've pretty much got a good chunk of their tour team there, don't they?
That's right. And I mean, it's the same for Jumbo-Visma. They've kind of come tooled up with all their big guys, apart from pretty much Roglic, I understood did want to ride because he wanted to add Catalunya to his list of stage races, but they told him he can't. And it's, I think the Volta's a brilliant race. I mean, it's notoriously hit by bad weather every year, but the bad weather's just been this last week in the Pyrenees. So the next few days look really, really good. And the key stages, the first couple of stages are usually sprints, but the key stages are stages 3 and 4, and they go up to Volta 2000 on stage 3, which is almost 2,200 metres, which is a really high climb for this part of the season. They'll be riding through big drifts to get up there, I'm sure. And then the next day they go up to this really beautiful little climb, Portenay, which again is almost 2,000 metres, a little ski resort. And those are the 2 days that are probably going to decide the race. Although the day after that, when they come away from the Pyrenees and sort of back towards Barcelona again, there's another very lumpy day, I think, to Manresa. And that'll be hard as well. So, 7-day race, finishes with a beautiful finish on the Montjuïc circuit in Barcelona. It's really lovely. Don't miss it.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. So, Jeremy, one of the names that was mentioned there by Pete is Chris Froome. Still maybe one of the biggest names in cycling, although obviously we haven't seen him for a while now. Where is he at form-wise? Because he's still talking about wanting to get this 5th Tour de France. Him doing well here at Volta Catalunya, that would be surely imperative for him to have any chance of winning this 5th.
Yeah, I think the tide is turning a bit where I think there's quite a lot of goodwill towards him just being able to make his comeback. Now he's made his comeback. He's obviously done kind of the latter half of last season with Ineos. Then he's moved on to Israel Startup Nation, and now I think the chips are down and he has to start showing the form that we associate with him, and he looks a long way off. The last outing that I saw was in the UAE race, and he looked a long way short of where he needs to be, particularly in the climb. So this week for him, it also includes a time trial, doesn't it, Pete? Isn't there a 18k time trial, I think? Is that right?
Yes.
You could be right, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's got all the elements to really see how he backs up with kind of riding a time trial, which obviously would be fairly intense, and then these 2 big mountain stages as well, which, as you say, go up to altitude, proper altitude, aren't they, for this time of year, and the kind of altitude that compares with the Grand Tours as well. So this will be a really good acid test, and everybody says never doubt Chris Froome, and Chris Froome's this and Chris Froome's that, and he's got incredibly ice cold mentality about his own ability, and he'll be there when he needs to be there at the rendezvous for the Tour, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it is now an awfully long time since he won a big race. I feel like the racing has changed
a little bit as well. I'm interested to see how he actually approaches it, because he doesn't normally race a lot, does he, at the beginning of the season or in the lead up to his bigger objectives? He normally trains. And David Brailsford, like the boss of his former Ineos Grenadiers team, came out at the start of the year saying, after what we saw racing last year and teams like Jumbo-Visma and UAE Emirates, or Pogačar really, completely sort of changing the course of how a Grand Tour is raced and won. I'd be interested to see if, with a new team as well, how Froome approaches it, whether he sort of keeps with his sort of steam train lead up, or whether he does have to, as Ineos supposedly is going to, really mix it up in terms of pace and just general approach.
The other thing I just wanted to mention before we moved on is Marc Hirschi. Now, Jeremy, the story about Marc Hirschi I've sort of been aware of because he was one of the big names of 2020. He had those couple of great stages in the Tour de France where he got close and it didn't happen for him and it was heartbreak, and then he won the stage. What has been happening over the off-season, and where is he now?
Good question. I mean, he was a sensation, wasn't he, last autumn at the Tour de France, and then he won Flèche Wallonne as well. So people are kind of quite confused about what happened after that, because he basically, it wasn't even at the 11th hour, it was kind of 1 minute past midnight, he left Team Sunweb, as they were quite extraordinarily, in extraordinary circumstances, just suddenly overnight he was no longer with them, and then resurfaced a few days later at the UAE Emirates team. But he hasn't actually ridden for UAE Emirates, and he's been conspicuous by his absence. And there was lots of talk. I mean, Pete, I know you were talking to people at Paris-Roubaix about this, weren't you? There was lots of kind of speculation and rumours about really what's been going on. But it's very odd for a rider that highly rated to not have appeared yet. And obviously, this week at the Volta in Catalunya is his first appearance of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that when I was at the Tour last year, I was talking to a Swiss journalist there, and Hirschi, it must have been in between the stage that he almost won and the one that he did win. And I was just sort of talking what a remarkable rider he seemed to be. And he said, oh yeah, Sunweb are already offering him around to other teams, you know. I'm like, what do you mean? He's still got another year on his contract. And it's like, no, they want him out. It seemed, I mean, the way that I read it then was that Sunweb wanted, when we didn't know it at that point, but Sunweb, where the holiday company that backed the team, were obviously having massive financial problems because of COVID, and they were going to pull their sponsorship out. And so the management behind the Sunweb cycling team appeared to want money, and Hirschi leaving for UAE, I assumed would be a way for them to get some money in terms of a transfer fee. But it sounds like there's something else going on there. Hirschi won't talk about it because he signed a non-disclosure agreement. Sunweb or Team DSM of the management have all signed them as well. So nobody really knows. It's just kind of, there was a report in the Belgian press that Team DSM were worried about his blood passport values. Nobody's been able to back that up because nobody's talking. So we're really all in the dark about what's going on.
I've interpreted it in two ways. I read a report, and as Pete said, because no one's talking about it, it's as good as gossip. But in terms of the money factor, I read that he was on €70,000 with Sunweb or Team DSM, and UAE offered him something to the tune of 1 million. So that could be a factor. But he himself, the only thing I've really read of him talking about it was that he sort of didn't like the structure at Sunweb or DSM. And I've spoken to Michael Matthews before, who also got out of his contract earlier and returned to Bike Exchange this season. And he just said that, you know, there's constant meetings, there's constant phone calls, the team's constantly checking in with riders. They insist on you working with their own team staff, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But for Matthews, and I think Hirschi sort of intimated perhaps to a similar thing, that it just got a bit too much, or it wasn't consistent with their style and how they want to work.
His manager's Fabian Cancellara, his agent rather is Fabian Cancellara. That's right, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, Cancellara obviously is a very high-profile figure. You can't imagine he would back down in the face of a sponsor making certain demands of a rider if he didn't agree with them.
Absolutely not. And I mean, Hirschi and Cancellara have been very close. I mean, I think their relationship goes back quite a few years when Hirschi was kind of a teenage rider in Switzerland and kind of starting to make a name for himself. Then there was introductions, and Hirschi now lives pretty close to Cancellara. I mean, within walking distance, I think, almost. So they've got this close bond, and I'm guessing that Cancellara perhaps didn't see DSM as a team that could take Hirschi to where he wanted to be, which was winning all these big races, the classics and whatever, and featuring the Tour de France, because DSM really haven't got an attack that allows them to do that. They can win these races, they can win stages at the Tour, but I mean, they're not going to really challenge consistently in the way that UAE or one of the kind of the mega teams is going to.
DSM also has that history, doesn't it, where it's famous for developing riders and seeing them break through. Then it doesn't really keep them for much longer after they do that. You know, look at Tom Dumoulin, Marcel Kittel, John Degenkolb, sort of hit Tour de France stage-winning levels with them and then moved on actually relatively quickly.
Yeah, they've got a lot of very, very good young riders. I mean, like Casper Pedersen, Nieuwenhuis, Kees Bol, who won a stage at the Paris-Nice last week. I mean, they've got a lot of great riders coming through now. And, I mean, Hirschi's a big loss for them, but they'll find somebody to fill his place pretty quickly, I should think.
They will, and I think we'll find out over the course of this next week at the Volta Catalunya what's actually going on. Maybe somebody will get a chance to talk to him. Pete, if you can find those snow chains, maybe you'll get to talk to him. Who knows?
Can he not ski? Can you not ski?
Yeah.
You've not seen me on skis, Jeremy. That's not a great idea.
Jeremy, another question for you. Maybe when you're at your leisure in the States, Australia or Canada, how do you watch the Spring Classics?
OJ, I watch them at flowbikes.com/aerogram.
That's flowbikes.com/aerogram. Another question for you. What are you wearing when you're watching the Spring Classics?
Usually lounging pants these days. Mail order lounging pants.
Now, the 83rd edition of Gent-Wevelgem in Flanders Fields is where Mads Pedersen is returning to defend his title. Second race in the Flanders Cycling Week. Pete, what makes this race so special? Why should we be excited for it?
Well, it's known as a Sprinters Classic, although it's a lot
tough for a Sprinters Classic.
It's hard. It's a hard race. The key feature of it has always been the Kemmelberg, which is this brutally hard cobbled climb, kind of right in the middle of the World War I battlefield. So it's quite an iconic place. There's a memorial to the fallen on the top of it, and cobbled all the way up. And there is a cobbled descent on one side, but I don't know whether they still use that. There was some very bad crashes on that. But they go over the Kemmelberg twice. That's kind of a key point. But I mean, the race is hard all the way through. I mean, they race in the wind a lot, or they're probably going to race in the wind a lot because it's very open where they are. They've got this new section now called the plug streets, these kind of gravel roads that they race on in between the two bits of the Kemmelberg. And it was interesting. You mentioned flow bikes. When I was at Paris-Nice, I was working very nearby to Flow Bikes correspondent Gregor Ron Burgundy Brown at Paris-Nice, and
that's double barreled.
It is. He was interviewing
Burgundy Brown.
He was interviewing a lot of riders about the Kemmelberg and plug streets, and they were saying just how difficult it was, the kind of running these gravel roads, and then the cobble climbs, and then you have the wind. And the distance of the race, I think it's kind of getting up towards 250 kilometres. It's brutally hard. So, I mean, even though it probably will end up with a sprint, it's probably not going to be a very good big group that's disputing it.
Who's in the group then? Who's in that sprinters group? Sam Bennett's there. Nizzolo's there. Who's going to win it, in your eyes?
Well, Mads Pedersen won it last year. I don't know why they're still calling it a sprinters race, because if you look at like top 5, top 10 from last year and previous seasons, to me, like the result sheet in a way reads more like an Ardennes Classic.
You think it's a kind of race that suits? I mean, I was looking at last year's results: Pedersen, Seneschal, and then Trenting, and you'd think it's the kind of race that Michael Matthews would be suited to, Sophie. But has he ever done well there? I can't remember now.
He sort of looks to aim further afield. He targets the Ardennes Classics more so.
I think one of the things I love about this race is it starts. I think it starts now every year in Ypres, which is my favourite place in Belgium because I spent some time there, and also I love the kind of very melancholic but also really beautiful atmosphere of the fields and the landscape around Ypres, and the Kemmelberg itself is just an amazing bit of road and murderous. The cobbles are murderous. If you ever get the chance to actually go and watch the race or to walk up it or even ride up it. And the descent, as you say, Pete, I think the descent was removed. The cobble descent that was really bad was removed a few years ago after a really nasty crash with, I think Andre Schmil was really bad injured there.
I remember Jimmy Casper was badly injured there as well.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, dreadful.
Yeah. And anyway, when I went to Ypres a few years ago to do a travel feature, bizarrely, not a cycling feature, a travel feature. And I spent a lot of time in Flanders Fields Museum with the researchers there, the historians there. And that whole area is incredible because farmers still dig up these bombs, the gas canisters, and they're still live. It's actually still an active sort of war zone in some ways, and occasionally on building sites somebody will disturb a bomb and it will go off and they will be killed, and they get added to the list of the casualties of war even over 100 years later. So it's got this real atmosphere, that race, I think, that I find both spooky and compelling.
Which is where the Gent-Wevelgem in Flanders Fields come from. That's the reference to the title there.
That's right, yeah.
I've got a question for you, a pop quiz question. Here you go. See if you can answer this. One Briton and one American has won Gent-Wevelgem. Can you name them, and can you name me the year?
Just let me Google.
No, you can't. No Googling allowed here, Sophie.
Did Barry Hoban win
It was Barry Hoban. In what year?
74.
1968.
74. Did you Google that, Peter?
No, I didn't, no.
Okay, so who's the American and in what year?
Davis Finney?
Nope.
Absolutely.
This is
Just
dead air.
Just give me a moment.
You realise
it's
this is dead air,
to me.
OJ?
It's coming to me.
Ride for US Postal.
Ekimov?
Nope. 2001.
Fred Rodriguez?
No, George Hincapie. 2001.
Oh, wow.
Was the winner of that race. So come on then, give me your tips. Give me your tips for who is winning Gent-Wevelgem. I want a name from everyone and I want to know how they're winning it. Is it a bunch sprint?
Yes. It's inevitably a bunch sprint because there will be a group will move clear over the top of Kemmelberg, and then it will come back. Then there'll be a furious chase, and it will come back together in the last kilometre and a half. You've got to say Wout van Aert, haven't you?
I'm gonna say that De Koning will win it, which I guess is not putting my neck out too far. But having been reminded about Florian Sénéchal's near miss last year, and also the form that Remy Cavagna, the two French guys, are in, I would like to see one of those guys win it. That'd be great, I think.
Would put maybe a cheeky each-way bet on Mads Pedersen to go back-to-back.
Ooh, now you see, I'm not going for Mads Pedersen, but I'm going for a Trek rider, and that is Jesper Stuyvens is there as well. So I reckon he's going to two in 2 weeks.
He'd have been drunk all week, though.
Yeah, exactly.
He's going to say that's a big call as well.
He's going to be drunk all week. He'll be the perfect vibe for it. All right, well, that is it for this week's podcast. We'll have, of course, all of the results and the feedback and find out if any of us got it right, the winner of Gent-Wevelgem next week, and we'll be looking ahead to, hopefully, to Paris-Roubaix on the next episode. Thank you to Jeremy, to Peter, and to Sophie. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, OJ.
Thank you.
Thank you. Make sure you follow us
Cheers.
at Peloton Magazine. More writing and insight at LaCourse on Tête.com. And as always, please do check out, if you're in America or Australia or Canada and you want to watch the Spring Classics, please do check out our presenting sponsor. You can subscribe now, flowbikes.com/Aérogramme. That is flobikes.com/Aérogramme. I wanted to end this week's podcast with a Flemish saying, but I found out when I jumped into Google Translate, there's no such language as Flemish. So instead, I've got a Dutch one. Het heft geen zin om, and I apologise to all Dutch people listening to this, ten wachten tot je schip binnenkomt, ten je unhupt Oostergeurt. Anyone got what that is?
Absolutely no clue.
Okay. It's the proverb, it's no use waiting for your ship to come in unless you've sent one out. There you go. We'll see you next week.
I dream of you, chips, chips. Da-ti-do-di-do, chi-boom, chi-boom-boom. Da-ti-do-di-do, chi-boom, chi-boom-boom. Da-ti-do-di-do.